the great pleasure of co-authoring a couple of books on the role of the CISO, former Gartner analyst, and like you, love all things cybersecurity. So really excited about our discussion today. Andy.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm Andrew Thorpe, partner at Gunderson Dettmer in their San Francisco office. I've been, basically I'm in the public companies group here. I've been doing this for about 25 years. Started my career at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the Division of Corporation Finance, reviewing, IPO filings and whatnot, and all manners of disclosures. Kind of seen it all from, back when I started, the internet was just kicking off. It was, Yahoo was the big company. Seen the development of the cloud. It was the Internet of Things for a while, and now it's AI. So definitely seen how the market develops and how disclosure typically, the SEC's disclosure program typically lags behind the market, and so we can discuss that. But thank you very much for having me.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you so much. Before we dive in, of course, we need to do the usual, which is, this presentation is for informational purposes only. We are expressing our own opinions. Of course, you should be seeking your own advice on these topics. So let's dive in a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of background just at a high level. You probably haven't been able to avoid hearing about the new SEC rules that have come into play in late last year, December of 2023. There are two main prongs to this. So one being that the new rules require, public companies to disclose material incidents within 4 business days of making that materiality determination. There's also the second prong, which is public companies now have to report on an annual basis to describe its cybersecurity program and practices, including how it identifies and manages material risks, and also sort of what the governance and oversight practices are, and how it maintains them. So, ostensibly these new disclosures are to allow shareholders to make those informed decisions around the investments they're making in public company securities. And then you add to that, now there's this increased focus at all levels. So we're talking FTC, the state's attorneys generals, the SEC, and highlighting a couple of things here, no judgments, but we've all heard about the 𝗂𝗶𝘃𝗴 case and its former CISO. 𝗵𝗏𝗏 is another one. They had a $50 million settlement for alleged violations of state consumer protection laws. And then most recently, and very interesting, I think, is the SolarWinds case. The SEC has brought not only against the company, but also its CISO, alleging fraud based on internal controls failures in its cybersecurity practices. So we've also actually seen hackers, right, that are hacking companies, public companies, and then, reporting on them to try and further extort based on, quote unquote, non-compliance with these rules. So, all of this is to say sort of the background is, the kind of raises the anxiety level, I would say, of public companies, but also maybe private companies that have aspirations of going public and or supporting, customers and suppliers and vendors that are now facing these new disclosure rules. So we're going to talk more about what that means for the role of the CISO. We're, through this sort of tricky time and what it means for that office and what it means for cyber programs and implementation generally. So with that, let me make sure I advance the slides. So, one of the first questions is sort of this warranted versus unwarranted CISO fears. So Matt and Andy, I think anecdotally we've heard because of this increased, visibility, CISOs might be running a little bit scared right now, and maybe they're feeling like they're being made the scapegoat a little bit without some of the protections maybe other exec officers get. So maybe Matt, let's start with you. And Andy, of course, please feel free to jump in.
I would offer CISOs in terms of fear and concerns, everything. We are inherently a paranoid type. Our job is to be paranoid. to be concerned about risk in all its forms and guises throughout the organization. And I think one of the areas, Colleen, to your point, in kind of this excellent overview of kind of what is the current status right now of our role, there's a risk if you're disconnected with your executive leadership team and your board in how things are disclosed to regulators, to markets, to key stakeholders throughout the organization. So from my perspective, I think one of the most critical things is ensuring that there's a level of transparency in terms of the status of our respective security programs, the risks that we're able to address, the risks that, equally important, we're not able to meaningfully address, and how that is conveyed to the executive leadership team, to the board of directors, and for public companies, ultimately to the investment community, whether it's in the form of a Form 8K, kind of an interim type of disclosure, to an annual or quarterly report. So the CISO role right now, I think fundamentally is really exposed to a number of dynamics. You know, we are by definition, in many cases, the bearer of bad news. Here's the things that we can't control for. I can't control if a nation state targets our updating software and is able to get access to things. Those are things I can control for. But there's risk there that most other organizations or most other roles within an organization don't necessarily come up against. You know, most CFOs aren't worried about organized crime attacking their operations and their general ledger the way CISOs have to worry about organized crime, nation states, all this really nefarious activity that tends to hit our organizations from any number of different angles. So I would say it's a reasoned paranoia, if you will.
Right. And in my view is there's actually now my advice to CISOs, you're not alone.
Yeah.
Most companies have pretty robust cybersecurity practices, policies, infrastructure. Now I think the focus of senior management and the legal department is going to sort of be enhanced on those infrastructures. So really, the challenge is now taking the existing cybersecurity infrastructure and policies and procedures at the company and sort of marrying them up with the disclosure apparatus. And then, I always say, when you go public, you are now in the business of being a public company.
Yeah.
And that means it's like one of your business lines is public company compliance, which is, for software companies, you are in the business of cybersecurity. Now, the bottom line is, I think this is the result of the SEC's rules and enforcement focus is now going to be more resources pouring into the cybersecurity infrastructure. And I think that should give CISOs more confidence. And then the last thing I'll say is, it's not like the SEC is going after foot faults. It's, the majority of these cases are kind of egregious situations where there was, everyone knows it's difficult to assess materiality, to assess the impact, to assess the scope of a cybersecurity incident. But a lot of these enforcement actions relate to basically hiding the ball. You've discovered something, the scope was worse than originally thought, and you don't tell anyone about it, and therefore the disclosure ends up being misleading. So those are sort of things I would say to kind of give CISOs a little bit more comfort in today's environment.
Well, and that goes to one of the questions that just popped up here, which is around, how do CISO sort of avoid some of the pitfalls or the common pitfalls in making sure that they comply with the disclosures. And I'll sort of add on to this a little bit, which is, one of the things that was interesting in reading through the SolarWinds case was, the SEC focused quite heavily on sort of what was out there as being in terms of public disclosures around their information security practices and sort of a misalignment with maybe what was happening internally. At least that's what's alleged. And so sort of this overarching question of, I think companies want to be transparent, I think ultimately, but trying to navigate and make sure that they're not being held liable. And so it goes more to that sort of overall, how do we avoid the pitfalls question. So I'd love to get some thoughts on that.
You know, what was interesting, Colleen, is almost immediately after some of these recent pronouncements by the SEC, I had a number of colleagues that are in this community, fellow CISOs, and it was almost as though, what happens if we have a breach? Are we going to go to jail? Are we going to be named in a lawsuit, derivative lawsuits, whatever the case may be, if there is a security incident? And clearly, that's not the expectation of the SEC. What the SEC is looking for is a level of transparency. And I think what's going to be very interesting is understanding what degree of transparency, what is communicated. If we think about it in Sarbanes-Oxley terms, we have deficiencies that might be communicated to a manager, significant deficiencies which are communicated to the board, and material weaknesses which are ultimately communicated to the investment community, typically via kind of the annual report. We have to start thinking almost in those terms vis-a-vis our security programs and the status related to it. And Andy, to your point, I think the unique circumstances that we saw with SolarWinds, that we saw with Uber, are really not indicative of what the SEC is looking to do. They are just effectively trying to advocate for the investment community that the nature and extent of digital risks, cyber risks that our organizations confront needs to be conveyed in SEC terms, kind of in non-boilerplate language. And so I think that's really kind of a high-level objective.
Right. I have basically, the SEC is a disclosure organization. They basically, they can't stop a company from raising money as long as the company has proper disclosure. So they have implemented what I call behavior through disclosure. So they can't say you have to do X, Y, and Z, but they can say, tell us what you guys do for X, Y, and Z. And that's what they're doing here. Says nobody wants to say we have horrible cybersecurity, we're extremely vulnerable, which, you know, almost, if you read the SolarWinds case, it seems like that might be what the SEC expected. But at the end of the day, there's an art to the disclosure. It's threading the needle, getting the message out to the investment community, not actually disclosing enough to give anyone a roadmap to what your vulnerabilities are, but basically not, you know, sort of, yeah, it's the idea of transparency, but not giving too much. So it really is an exercise of threading the needle. And then you read the SolarWinds case and you kind of think, well, wait, is the SEC going after them for, you know, for failure to remediate all the risks they identified, or is it going after, you know, is it going after bad cybersecurity protection, or is it going after failures of disclosures? I mean, that was something, you know, I found difficult to assess. But at the end of the day, I do think having to disclose what your policies and procedures are, what the oversight is, you're like, okay, I can come up with some great disclosure. Then you have to actually say, oh wait, do we do all this? And so the hope is, and I'm sure the result will be, companies are going to shore up their cybersecurity programs as part of this whole exercise. And you know, I think having the legal team more involved in this is actually going to take a little bit of burden off of CISOs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and Andy, you mentioned something which is important, which is the art behind this, meaning that you have to strike the balance between being transparent but not providing a guide to bad actors on what may be, you know, an issue in your program or what you're identifying as risks. Right.
And I just think it's going to be a team effort because look, you know, as a disclosure lawyer, I do not have expertise in cybersecurity. And I guess part of what I do is I kind of interpret all the technical, complex, you know, language that a cybersecurity expert would have and try and translate that into what an investor wants to see, what the SEC wants to see. So that's kind of there's a balancing act there.
And what they would want to know, right? What they would want to know in order to make that informed decision, essentially.
Right. Yeah. Where there's important risk, I think, for the CISO role is where the CISO, where he or she is aware of a fact pattern, if you will. that's indicative that there's real risk. But when that's communicated to the CFO, to the disclosure committee, or to general counsel, they look at it and say, well, I kind of think we're actually doing some of these things maybe a little bit better, and you're kind of paranoid, and maybe you tend to overstate these things. So I think we're going to be comfortable indicating that the risks are not to the degree that you would indicate. Now the question becomes, does that CISO have an obligation to inform? Do they have a potential whistleblower type requirement, if you will, especially where there's fundamental fact patterns that differ from what ultimately is communicated? Part of it is kind of, I was in a mock trial recently for a security event, and my defense, I was the CISO on the stand, as it were, was effectively, I was not a member of the disclosure committee. What I communicated to the executive leadership team and the board of directors ultimately didn't get conveyed in what was disclosed to the market. Those are the types of risks that I think we're going to start to see more frequently now, where there are fundamental disconnects on perspective, on the level of risk, the degree of materiality between the CISO and his or her organization and the extended executive leadership team.
Well, I don't see any way that the CISO is not going to be consulted by the disclosure committee on a quarterly basis. And I do think there's going to be a second look at some of these incidents that are reported. And I never thought of, the CISO, people might perceive the CISO as being paranoid and overstating the risk. But at the end of the day, there's as long as the CISO reports it up, and especially I think the disclosure committee is important, that there's interaction between the CISO and the disclosure committee. But then the kind of their job is done, and it's like up to the company to, up to the disclosure apparatus to determine whether it's material.
Exactly.
But I do think there's a risk also, because I think as part of this, the new rules, there's going to be more reporting to the board, or more robust reporting, because there's, at the end of the day, there's also, the board might have liability on, if they fail to monitor these risks. And so something I've seen in boardrooms is just board members don't appreciate the risk. So they get the report. No one wants to look like they don't understand it. And so it's like the severity is not actually communicated to the board. And I think that's important to try and get that. If the board's not engaging, perhaps it means they don't actually appreciate the severity. So I think that's an important role for legal to, as I said, as a translator, to kind of understand, is the CISO being paranoid? Is this a real risk? If it is, we got to make sure the board understands it so that they can, appropriately advocate for resources to remediate those risks.
Well, and this may mean also making sure you have sort of the right board makeup, if you will, or audit committee makeup, where you have folks that have sort of backgrounds, in cybersecurity, where they sort of can help determine the difference between something, that's more the sky is falling, or, oh, no, this is actually a real risk we need to take seriously.
One last thing before we hit the next topic there. I think to Andy's point, and Colleen, to yours as well, is the evidentiary level. If an organization says we've assessed cyber risk, well, what is the actual evidence of having done some sort of programmatic review of that organization's security capabilities, whether it's penetration testing, which is a subset of assessments? I think it's really critical. Similar, going back to the analogy with Sarbanes-Oxley here, you've got to have evidence of these internal controls. In this case, the internal controls over your cybersecurity risk. And so I think the CISO, he or she really needs to be front and center, demanding that what's being communicated is actually corroborated in the day-to-day and the procedural context of that organization's security program.
Right. And my guess is that if there's a real issue and the CISO or the equivalent is not getting the attention, that there is this sort of more flexibility to whistleblow in this new environment.
Right. And then the only thing I'll add to this is the importance of having a team in place, or outside consultants, auditing the controls, that basically having a system that identifies weaknesses, but also just having the team in place in case there is a breach. You're not starting from scratch. You guys, there've been tabletop exercises done before. You know who to call, and you're not scrambling to get a team together to respond. And I think it's important to have that team on an ongoing basis, to have interaction with senior management, to have interaction with the board. I think that'll go a long way at reducing risk.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that we could spend all day talking on just this, but I'm gonna advance the slide so we can get to our next topic here. So, based on what we've just chatted about, what does the CISO role look like going forward? I think part of this is sort of my guess. I think we all agree having the updated rules gives CISOs a little bit more authority, I would say, and credibility internally, within the company. But what should CISOs be asking for from their executive management, right? What does it look like going forward? Sounds like they need to be brought into the disclosure tent, but maybe they need to be looking at D&O insurance and other things like that. But I will leave it to you both.
I think one thing that the CISO really needs to be able to have is access to the executive leadership team and the board of directors to convey the fact pattern. And that fact pattern has to move from anecdotal in opinion to more of a data-driven review of the organization. Colleen, if you were the CFO, fundamentally, you're dealing with bank reconciliations, cash reconciliations, any number of different variables. We need to be in a position to have really data-driven analyses with key risk indicators, metrics related to our security programs, so that the status of the security program doesn't come as a surprise to other members of the executive leadership team nor the board of directors, just like, oh, we ran out of cash. How did that happen? Why didn't, no one told us. These are things that are knowable. But as a practice, the CISO role hasn't really been thought of as a business leader overseeing an element of an organization's kind of resiliency and its ability to deliver kind of business outcomes, the ability to deliver services, process transactions in a secure, well-governed manner. So the CISO, effectively, he or she needs to up their game and be well-versed on kind of their organization, business dynamics related to it, the industry, sectoral considerations, regulatory considerations, as well as that in-depth technical knowledge of what's going on. And then similarly, the executive leadership team needs to be soliciting that feedback. They need to make sure that the CISO is actually at the table and that particular fact pattern is actually part of how they're reviewing the organization.
Yeah. And I guess this gets to a bit of the org structure, right? So it sounds, based on what I'm hearing, is there needs to be no layers basically between the CISO or the equivalent and the board and the exec team.
Just to highlight it real quick, I think it was Aristotle that said it best when he said intermediation is bad. The CISO should not be intermediated from, those stakeholders that are really kind of seminal to the organization. So, Andy, sorry about that.
Right. No, I was just going to say, I think the CISO, there needs to be part of training to understand kind of disclosure, the purpose of it. But I agree with everything everybody said. I mean, I think some of the, the incidents that happened, basically like in SolarWinds, there, the CISO was definitely seen as a marketing tool. Like there was, the security of the product. There were blogs, there were podcasts, the CISO was part of it. There was the statement on the web about the security, the what do they call it? The trust center.
Trust center, yeah.
And basically, but the fact is, there were statements in those posts that were literally not true when they say they follow X, Y, and Z standard. And so the bottom line is, I think the CISO does need to kind of understand, like, half truths aren't going to cut it.
Yeah.
Like, you need, yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, and I do think they can kind of work with legal and disclosure counsel to try and understand, how do we get the message across, but without actually using half truths.
Yeah. And I'll just highlight here, if I put myself in the shoes of a CISO or an equivalent, I probably am going to be asking for things like a company indemnification agreement. Should I be covered under D&O insurance? Probably things like that, where maybe, certainly probably those conversations have happened in the past, but I think this will be more routine. Thoughts on that?
And it is interesting, the difference, every company should have a cybersecurity insurance policy. Like general business insurance no longer covers cybersecurity.
Right.
And that goes to me talking about building the team. That cybersecurity policy will say you have to use, basically these law firms are on the panel. So but the bottom line is creating the relationship with sort of the approved service providers in your cybersecurity and policy is important. And I do think there's going to be a little bit of a shakeout between these disclosure liabilities, the liabilities for failing to disclose something, is that covered under cybersecurity or is that covered under the D&O policy?
Yep.
The important thing is to go through the policies and make sure there's no gaps.
Yep.
I will tell you anecdotally, I know a number of fellow CISOs that are actively seeking counsel outside of the organization to effectively validate what level of risk and exposure do they have precisely because of this. Because most CISOs are not covered under D&O. Directly, Andy, to your point, most CISOs are not indemnified. So there's a number of functional things that we're going to need to start doing to reduce the risk, or we're going to have to kind of allocate funding to be able to do that, to have external counsel, employment counsel, whatever the case may be, to mitigate some of these risks.
Yep. We received a question here, so want to throw that out to the team. What trends or developments can we expect in the cybersecurity and legal landscape in 2024 that may further impact CISOs and organizations? So great question. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll jump in. I think there's going to be a huge emphasis on defending what is, quote, reasonable security. Again, if I go back to the analogy of finance and accounting, if you guys were CFOs or controllers, we wouldn't be debating the definition of expenses or liabilities or income, et cetera. And so I think one of the things that needs to occur is having greater kind of consensus on what a reasonable security program looks like, how it's defensible in terms of the data and the metrics related to it. I think that's going to continue. And I don't see anything fundamentally changing with just the extreme dynamics of our particular role. We're expected to know everything from generative AI and large language models all the way up to, Virginia just passes a privacy regulation and requires X when it comes to security. So you're having to know everything from bits and bytes at one extreme to regulatory and kind of sectoral type detail at another. The charge against the role is enormous. The remit of the CISO is extraordinarily expansive. Third-party vendors, your application security, your infrastructure security, cloud security, all the regulatory environment. And so I think the role itself will ultimately transform from the CISO to more effectively the office of the CISO. Larger organizations are already doing that, where you've got delegation, you've got business information security officers that focus on different areas. But the role just continues to be extraordinarily demanding. And unfortunately, one of the dynamics of the role is you're always going to get that call. There's going to be a security incident, there's going to be something that occurs, and you're the person that is effectively kind of the titular head of the security program. And you're going to be dealing with incident response and going to really fall under the question of, why didn't we see it? What was it we didn't see that we should have seen? Where was the missing telemetry and how serious are the implications? So,
right. I agree with that wholeheartedly. It's like the CISO's job was hard enough just dealing with real threats. Now you have to worry about, what is the investment community going to think? but I do agree that the trend is going to be more resources pouring in to CISO organizations, because in the event of an actual incident, you need to assess it, remediate it. There's a PR aspect to it. How do you disclose to the public? Well, there's all the state law notice requirements you need to assess, and now you have the SEC. Disclosure. You have to determine, is it material? Do we require disclosure? And the CISO just can't do that alone. That there needs to be a very big team involved to handle all of those aspects.
So we have another question that's come in. What is a CISO's role or responsibility for determining what constitutes a material cyber event? So very timely, kind of started going down that path. It's a great question. I'm thinking that is different for each company, because I think what is material on some level, like, yes, we have the SEC guidance, but what is deemed material can be different depending on what business you're in. So
I would respectfully suggest it's certainly a group decision. That decision should not be made in isolation. I go back to the SEC's view. I'm a reasonable investor. Would this fact pattern materially change my decision to buy, hold, or sell a particular equity? And then similarly, if there's a little bit of ambiguity on that, kind of default to what is in the investor's best interest. What that almost suggests to me is a level of more significant transparency. In other words, I might view that this is material, even if ultimately the investment community says, we get it, it happens. We see breaches all the time. It's not going to really change our view on the stock. But I think trying to cover up things or preclude things from reaching the marketplace almost strikes me as higher risk than the actual disclosure of things that ultimately don't prove to be material. But it has to be a collective decision, in my view.
Right. I mean, the problem with materiality is it's always viewed in hindsight. And you basically stated the standard under the Supreme Court for something's material if a reasonable investor would have viewed it as having significantly altered the total mix of information available. And so I don't know. My tool is, I use the refrigerator analogy. You open up the refrigerator, you see what's in there. What would significantly alter the total mix of your view of what's in the refrigerator? So it's like, is there a rotten egg that's stinking up everything else? That's probably significantly altering the total mix. That's the tool I use.
I love that analogy.
Believe me, with other security lawyers, I've gotten debates over whether Heinz ketchup or Hunt ketchup would be a material difference. I personally think it is. But yeah, so the idea, Matt had said, it's a group exercise. The SEC is saying, okay, is this going to hurt your reputation, your ability to sell products in the future? Is this going to be a significant cost from like a liability concern? Is it going to divert management resources? Is it going to impact the customers? Like, now the customers' information is out there.
Yeah.
What type of impact is it for them? So I mean, there's so many considerations in determining materiality. That's why I say it is more of an art than a science. And then the other thing is, just what would it look like as a headline on the Wall Street Journal? Company didn't fail to disclose major breach. So you have to kind of think about it from that perspective as well.
Well, and this is just a little bit of a gut feel for me, but it seems to me that when these disclosures are made, yes, the stock may do some things, but ultimately it recovers. So there's sort of this sense of disclosing is probably best when in doubt. I don't know if you'd agree, but
you have to take your medicine, at some point. But I guess there is a tension, because you don't want to disclose too early before you actually know all the facts, or have like at least enough facts to make a determination.
Yeah.
Because every company is being attacked constantly. And so the question is, okay, at the end of the day, yeah, finding out or making the assessment of, do we have enough information to even make a determination whether the public needs to know about this, or is this just an ordinary course breach? And that's, companies are just, they've been grappling with this for a long time, and I think this will, more resources will now be focused on this.
And I know this is a little bit of a crystal ball exercise, but I was very kind of curious with the SEC's filing against SolarWinds being quite close, I would say, to when the disclosure rules came out. More curious, do we think that's coincidence? Do we think this is sort of, a trend that we might see kind of going into 2024? Very curious about your perspective on that.
I mean, so the SEC's been sort of hovering around cybersecurity from the disclosure standpoint since 2011. They've put out statements saying, hey, our existing disclosure requirements require you to disclose, risks or impacts that cybersecurity has. In 2022, in May of 2022, the SEC doubled the size of its crypto assets and cyber unit. So now there's 50 enforcement attorneys dedicated to finding cases. Lo and behold, there's more lawyers, there's going to be more cases. So I think, I do think this is a trend.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of this aspect of, hey, the SEC doesn't, they want to be relevant. These are the issues that companies are facing today. These are the issues that do impact, the market value of a large sector of our economy. And I think the SEC kind of wants to say, hey, we were ahead of the game, or whether they're not ahead of the game or not, but at least, hey, we're sort of focused on a very current and pressing issue.
Matt, thoughts?
Yeah, I think clearly the trend is going to be more regulatory oversight. So we have, national focus on cybersecurity in certain sectors, healthcare, financial markets, things of that nature. But the other regulator that is really very much front and center in this is the Federal Trade Commission, and their enforcement of Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, unfair and deceptive trade practices. There's a much larger list of enforcement actions by the FTC. What may be interesting, thinking about a perfect storm here, is where an organization is in the crosshairs of both the SEC and the FTC for effectively some form of poor disclosure, or euphemistically, an unfair and deceptive trade practice. So I think the reality is we just live in an inordinately regulated environment. And there's one thing that our country in the US does better than any other country on earth: we litigate, we sue, so we are in a very litigious society, and the consequence of which is anything that kind of gets in the crosshairs of a regulator or potentially plaintiff's counsel is fair game. And it puts a lot of burden on the CISO role. They've got to make sure that they have a legally defensible security program.
Yeah.
That's a high bar.
It is a high bar. One of the questions we got, and I think we kind of addressed it, but there's this question around, do you think that public companies will be potentially over disclosing just out of, an abundance of caution? I don't know sort of what you've seen in practice.
I think we're going to get very boilerplate disclosures the first time this comes out. The good news is it is going to change the behavior of the company, saying, well, we need to let the public know that we actually, have a strong program in place. And then we do have oversight, but I don't think they're going to drive into the details. One of the consistent failures that is subject to SEC actions is risk factors. There's risk factors that are in the hypothetical. We may be subject to a cybersecurity attack, and it may have an effect, when in reality they know they have been, and that there has been a material effect. So I think that's not going to cut it anymore either. But I don't think there's going to be over disclosure, because that's what lawyers do. We thread the needle. We're going to make sure that we comply with the new disclosure requirements. but we're certainly, not going to provide sensitive information, and we're certainly going to make sure that what we do disclose is accurate and does not contain any material omissions.
Yep. Matt, anything to add there?
I just think the focus on disclosure is going to continue to increase. And to Andy, to your point, I think we're relatively good as it relates to Form 8Ks and incidents. I mean, I think we're going to have enough examples, sadly, in 2024 that how those are handled are going to very quickly become somewhat routine. It's a sad testament to the state of cybersecurity. Where I think there's other interesting disclosures would be, did the board of directors participate in, say, a tabletop exercise, or the executive leadership team in incident response training, things of that nature? If those stakeholders are effectively caught flat-footed, not knowing things that they should have known, or not being aware of something that should have been known, and then that differs materially from what's been disclosed in an annual report, 10K, 20F, whatever the case may be, that's high risk from my view. So even though as a CISO, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, it's kind of the status quo, I have more and more burden being dropped in on the role and the requirements of the program, I could flip it very easily and say, gee, if I'm an executive or a member of the board and I'm not doing these things correctly, I'm not overseeing the program correctly, will I be named in a derivative lawsuit if something happens? And so I think it forces two historically different stakeholder groups to start collaborating more. I think that's one of the most critical takeaways from everything with the SEC's guidance, is that they want greater disclosure, greater transparency, greater collaboration between various stakeholders.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. The one area I think, so when I was saying more boilerplate, I meant kind of the annual disclosure about oversight. And I do think the practices are going to change. I do think, for instance, a lot of the oversight of cybersecurity is lumped in with general risk management, which is typically tasked by, with the audit committee. I personally think the audit committee has too much on its plate. And I think a trend towards separate risk management committees or standalone cyber risk committees of the board. And I think that that's going to be a trend going forward. And it's, going to ultimately become sort of best practices. And I think the disclosure of how do you oversee cyber risk is going to spur on. Everyone's going to want to say, hey, we have a separate committee with expert, with board members that have deep experience. I think the most difficult area of disclosure is going to be vulnerabilities. Like, no, you don't have any evidence of a significant cyber threat, like not a threat, but an incident. Like, nobody's breached the system as far as you know, but there's vulnerabilities, and that's going to be where the problem is like, how do we disclose vulnerabilities? Because you certainly, don't want to tell the world of hackers out there, hey, we're a target. It's open season, but then you also worry about how is the SEC going to look at it if we stay silent on certain things. So I think that might be an area where there's going to be resources to make sure that there aren't, that there's more remediation going on, because it seems like a lot of the cases out there were persistent problems that people in the CISO department knew about, and they just didn't get fixed. And I think that might be a result of this, is you're not going to have these lingering vulnerabilities go on for extended period of time.
Right. And it goes back to that balance between, you can't go out with sort of a rubber stamped, disclosure that you may have provided 1 or 2, 2 years in a row. It needs to be thought through, but you also need to provide a map to your hackers on what may be issues in your environment.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a third topic, and I need to make sure that we get to it. So I'm going to get us moving forward here. So how can the CISO effectively manage risk? So I think we talked about this a little bit. It's not a matter of if, it is definitely a matter of when. Every company is going to face an incident at some point. And the question is, how do you handle it, and how what questions should the CISO be asking internally? And because we know a program cannot address every single thing. So you need to make some decisions and where you put your budgets and so forth. So Matt, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, I think going back in the CISO desk reference guide, I posited a question effectively: what is it that I don't see, and why don't I see it? And what are the implications or impacts to my organization? I think CISOs have to be inordinately inquisitive about the nature and extent of the telemetry that they're able to effectively oversee and manage from a risk perspective. Certainly one of the things that Sysdig is doing with respect to like runtime, how our applications are performing when they're actually being consumed. That's an area of risk that I think many organizations didn't look to historically. Similarly, third-party risk management. It's actually a subject of a forthcoming book that myself and a bunch of others are working on. Supply chain, vendors, third-party libraries, all these things. So I think one of the things that the CISO needs to almost be religious about is just that ongoing, constant questioning. What is it that we're not looking at, and why aren't we looking at it? And are those gaps material? So if I'm not looking at something that is immaterial, won't impact my company's reputation, its operations, its finances, things of that nature, that's fine. I feel fairly comfortable that we're not looking under that rock, but we have a general idea of what we might find if we did look under that rock, versus here's some other areas that, gee whiz, I have to understand this. I have to understand third-party code. I have to understand the quality of my application security. I have to understand vendor risk. I have to understand component and supply risk, concentration risk with some of the large cloud providers that are out there. So I think the CISO really is becoming effectively a risk officer in many ways. And he or she is having to categorize and distill risk, and then validating the information and the data related to the same, which is where I think we need to move ultimately from anecdotal analysis of our security program to very data-driven analysis of our security program, and having metrics, just like we would in finance and accounting or operations and manufacturing, where we have really well-defined data sets that help us kind of evaluate it. We need to do the same with respect to our security programs.
That's yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, the top concern should be the actual security and vulnerability and remediation and improvement on the disclosure, like the liability front. I personally think a CISO is going to have to do a lot to like actually get in the target of the SEC, but meaning I'll have to do a lot wrong. But I think if there's a good faith effort to carry out the policies, having a strong policy doesn't mean anything if you don't actually follow through or carry it out. So, actually having policies that work is an important aspect of effectively managing risk. Again, having the right team together, having outside auditors, look at the, do an audit of your cybersecurity measures. Training is important. more than just in the field of cybersecurity, but also how this affects governance, board governance, and the disclosure aspects of it, and even such thing as email etiquette. There's always a treasure trove of kind of like smoking gun emails.
Yeah.
Where non-lawyers are basically joking around. Those things are used against you. So my advice: don't put anything in an email that that in your worst scenario you wouldn't want to see public.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I would say Slack also is another one. I mean, I'm just thinking back to SolarWinds. There are a lot of those internal communications where it's probably some folks, frankly, just joking around. Right. And when you take it out of context, it doesn't look really great. So
that's what, in prosecutors, the SEC, DOJ, that is so powerful for them when they're like, oh, these guys were treating it, you know, as a joke. They were not serious about it. They knew about it. They didn't care about it. They're just bad actors.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the risks of now remote work is, you know, people aren't, I used to love the ability to like walk down the office, walk down the hall and have a conversation with somebody. That's just not happening now. We are using Slack. We are using emails more than ever. And so it's really important to be sensitive to what am I going to put in this email?
Yep.
I'm old enough to actually use a phone to call people.
No one wants to do that anymore now.
Yeah, exactly. But very seriously, though, when you're dealing with incidents, one of the things that I advise organizations is thinking about when and where and how do you go out of band, and, you know, thinking through very carefully the degree of discoverability that may result from some of the communications. And, you know, there's a time for gallows humor. Gallows humor, as a general rule of thumb, doesn't really come into play with respect to internal corporate communications on our cybersecurity program. So that's a training issue. But going back to the issue of training, you've got to instruct the team. Let's keep things fact-based. Let's keep things non-opinionated. Let's really think about what gets conveyed in a message, in a Slack channel, whatever the case may be.
So I want to make sure we had a couple questions come in. One question was, you know, are there any recommended, you know, resources or tools that CISOs can utilize to stay updated around cybersecurity regulation and just best practices? Because this is evolving, right? Like no one wants to be the first to have to report one of these incidents under the 8K.
Actually, somebody, there already was an 8K about a month ago that reported a cybersecurity incident.
Gotcha.
Somebody already was first.
Someone was already first. Okay, good. No one wants to be first. So I think there's probably some, you know, as these get filed, folks are probably going to kind of be looking to see like, how did they disclose and in what manner and so forth. But just any recommended resources around just how does CISO sort of stay current, essentially?
I think it goes back to almost an attitudinal dynamic. You have to be intensely curious about your industry, about your profession, your role within the organization, and read vociferously across any number of different areas. Certainly CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has a tremendous amount of good detail as it relates to known exploited vulnerabilities. Those are knowable. You know, you shouldn't be running a particular application or code that is, you know, literally being exploited in real time. That's knowable. I think one of the things that you see with respect to CISOs is that the role internally can be a little bit isolated. So it's really critical for CISOs to have communities where you can go and speak with fellow CISOs, learn from their experiences, frankly, from some of the bloodied knuckles in the battles that they fought historically. I know here in San Diego, we have a San Diego CISO Roundtable, a community of CISOs, and they have these now throughout the country. These are really valuable. And then in a plug to my esteemed colleagues on the call here, the legal community is doing the CISO world an absolute solid. They are laser focused in on some of these disclosure obligations, on what is, quote, reasonable security. And so I think there's tremendous value in having security practitioners and CISOs proactively working with counsel, proactively working with external counsel to understand these dynamics. You know, what is it that I don't know that I should know about disclosures that might impact my organization? Those types of things I think are really important.
So basically what you're saying is that CISOs and the legal team should just become best friends, is what
Absolutely. I'll buy you a cup of coffee.
Sounds great, Matt. Thank you.
I think that's the new normal is either having a dedicated security lawyer on in-house or having more interaction, more trainings. It should not be left to the CISO to figure this out on his or her, on their own, you know, on their own effort. It needs to be a team effort.
Yep. One other question that came in, which I love, is, you know, are there notable cases or an example where an organization, an org, if you will, has successfully navigated the SEC regulations, and maybe what lessons can be learned there?
I would suggest right now we're still relatively early. You know, the rule was, at least in terms of the 8K, the Form 8K disclosure coming out in January. But there's antecedents, as Andy and you are both aware. You know, in 2011, 2018, the SEC came out with preliminary guidance that ultimately was distilled into this. And so I think the way I would look at it is somewhat binary. There are companies and organizations that are well governed, that are transparent, that are trying to do everything they can to support their stakeholders, both within the organization and without, the investment community, investors, all that. And then there are other organizations that are playing a little bit loose with it. I think that is relatively self-explanatory. So, you know, my guidance is err on the side of transparency, focus on building out data-driven security programs, forcing collaboration. If I'm a CISO and I'm not at the table, I'm going to ask to be at the table. There's nothing precluding me from making that request. The executive leadership team or a board can say, yeah, we really appreciate it, but not now. That's on them. It's on me if I didn't make that request. So.
Right. And maybe that's a concern if they're saying no, right?
Yeah,
like, hey,
it's a red flag.
May not be the, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Andy, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as a lawyer, I only see what goes wrong, never what goes right. But there are companies out there that have significant, you know, disclosures already. Companies that have a cyber risk committee of their board already. Mm-hmm. Like those are probably the companies you look to that you know have best practices and that are out there. You know, as I said, it's every company is in its lifetime will have an incident, and so you know the key is, and then if you have an incident, I don't know how you avoid the lawsuit or the liability. You know that, but you know, at the end of the day, it's having everything in place, the team, the policies, the oversight. That's ultimately what's going to, you know, change the outcome.
Well, and one thing that's important too that I heard earlier, which is making sure you have the right contacts sort of on speed dial, because I have seen situations where folks may be scrambling to find communications folks or risk folks, and you know, trying to get those vendors in place right away. It's very difficult. It's
right.
Yeah, and you don't have that kind of time typically. So
can I add to that just very briefly, because it's something Sysdig did some threat analysis, and they looked at how quickly a particular environment would be compromised in a cloud setting where everything is automated, API driven. To your point, Colleen, about planning for these things, we need to do this. Our adversaries are operating in very automated, very sophisticated ways. If our incident response is manual, the game is already lost. And when you're measuring impact, 5 minutes here, another 10 minutes, and before you know it, you've got an environment that's compromised, this has to be muscle memory. We have to, from an incident response perspective, and that incident response is not just the technical response. It is that I need to contact counsel. Do we go under privilege? Who do we bring in for forensics?
Exactly.
It has to be real time.
Yep, that's exactly right.
The importance of tabletop exercises.
Yep.
You've been through it before, and now it's the real.
Yep.
You know, now it's the real thing.
That's right. Well, I know we are almost at time, and so I want to make sure that we get this last slide up with key takeaways. So, you know, Matt, maybe you want to run through this, but I mean, I'll just say personally, I feel that there's more encouraging things coming out of the discussion than discouraging. I think the role of the CISO has been elevated. And I also think that, you know, if it wasn't apparent before that it is an exercise that can't be done by one person, it needs to be a team internally. It needs to be close collaboration among the legal team and executive leadership and your board and potentially your audit committee and so forth. So anything else that either of you would want to highlight?
Andy?
I think you kind of said it all. So yeah, I'll pass it off to you, Matt.
I would just say take your counsel to coffee or lunch frequently. Point number 2 is critical. The collaboration is foundational.
Wonderful. I want to thank you both so much for your time. Very much appreciate it. If there were any questions that we didn't get to or other questions come up, you can reach out to any of the 3 of us on LinkedIn, and appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.